All right, everyone, welcome back to the Immersion Diaries, where we have my podcast, from Second Nature English. So it's an online English school at this point. Right now, we have the English course. There will be other courses and other Second Nature courses that we will be creating. Right now, we're working on the English production, but that is really for us to develop how to use language more intentionally. So we have pre-recorded courses, we have classes that test your communication skills, we have our online community with book clubs and debate clubs, and we also have some personalized training in accent training and also how to develop your communication style. So here on YouTube right now, we're going to be doing the Immersion Diaries. It is a podcast, so I have basically a list of topics, and what I do is that I just develop a few notes on the topic, and then this becomes a little bit more conversational, a little bit more chilled. Just us talking about the idea of how to think in English, how to develop our language skills, especially when we think about the idea of how do we find new words, how do we develop vocabulary, and why is it important for us to develop vocabulary. So we're going to get started with kind of a situation here. So imagine that we have a school, right? The school is not painted, and we have two groups of students. These groups of students, they come up with different ways to paint the school. They decided to become like volunteers, taking this task on, and basically one team decides that they would like to do it with rolls and brushes, and the other team decided to potentially like spray with paint. So both these groups, they have the same objective, right? The objective is to get the school painted. However, they have different types of approach, and they probably have reasons why they believe that approach is the approach that is going to be most beneficial for the group. So what they decide to do is just present, and we have like those two groups. We have, of course, these ideas, right? Sometimes an idea come from one person or from a small group of people, and then that kind of spreads depending on how other people believe that that idea will be the most beneficial one. So we have the groups of people that decided on these ideas, and then we have the other part of the other group, and this group pretty much they're a little bit undecided, so they need to basically figure out by themselves which one of the choices would be the best. So if I get into that context and I use the word, for example, when I talk about and I'm going to describe the other group to the people that I'm talking to, if I use the word adversary, that means that it's someone who has a different position than mine, someone who's in opposition to what I think, but at the same time, it doesn't carry hostility in it. It's pretty much sometimes what we would use when we're talking about sport matches, for example. That's another team. We both have conflicting interests. Our objective in this case is to play well and win the match. So I am against you, but I don't really think that your existence is a threat to mine. Which brings us then to the meaning of the word enemy. So if I use the word enemy, first of all, it's interesting when we think about different languages. So coming a little bit from my first language, which is Portuguese. If I call someone a friend, I'm going to call them amigo, amiga, amigi, whatever we want to use. But if I want to say the opposite, I would say inimigo. So in this case, I'm adding a prefix to say that this is not my friend. So this idea, and then in English you have friend and enemy, so you have like very different words to kind of have those different meanings, and they'll build off each other like they do in some languages that come from Latin. So in this particular case, we can see that the word that someone is not a friend is different than saying that someone has different ideas than I do. This word adversary, it provokes different types of thinking. It has a less likelihood of triggering an emotional response from people. When we think about words have different levels of complexity. The first word that we potentially will learn will be the word enemy. Just historically speaking, that's something that was kind of even though the words they will have kind of the same time in terms of origin, the connotation that they bring is basically that a non-friend is someone who's a threat. An adversary is someone who has something different to communicate. So that second idea, it is more complex to explain because there are reasons behind we would use the word adversary instead of the word enemy. So when we are thinking about this case here, you can see how if I am a person who doesn't necessarily understand the difference, the small difference, the nuanced difference between the words enemy and adversary, I could think them as synonyms. And in context, they will be synonyms, but they are not absolute synonyms, right? They don't really represent the same idea. But the word enemy brings more hostility. So if I don't necessarily develop my vocabulary or my language skills to the point that I understand the existence of the words enemy and adversary, and I don't allow also people to use the word enemy in a way that when I hear it, I am going to immediately believe that that's a threat, because also keep in mind that every communication that is passed to you, it is done by choice. In terms of the fact that when people communicate and when you develop the knowledge and how to use language, you will also understand the idea of the word rhetoric. So this is me understanding ideas, understanding concepts, but then choosing specific words, choosing in a specific tone to provoke a certain reaction. So that could be anything. So for example, when I say that when you took a look at the thumbnail for this YouTube video, language is a weapon, that is urgent, right? If I go and I change that to language is a tool, that is going to change those perspectives, and the reaction that you are going to have to those words is going to be different. So my objective when I create thumbnails, and that's going to be the nature of anybody here on YouTube, to be honest, will to be a provoke an emotion on you and saying, hey, this is urgent for me to see, I have to click on it. Now, if I understand that the word weapon is going to cause a lot more of a specific reaction, but I develop the idea that I understand the language is not necessarily a weapon, but it could be viewed as is, as we're talking about here now. And I understand the idea of like language as a tool, and I understand also what is the context of using this combination of words. Language is a weapon. The likelihood that I'm going to say, for example, yes, this is true, it becomes a little bit lower because I understand different words that would represent the idea of what language is a lot clearer, right? So let's imagine, for example, if I go into any historical or any kind of institution that we can see that we have a small group of people, and this small group of people is responsible for managing I don't want to use the word control, even though it's very easy to use. It's very tempting not to use the word control, but guide people into behaving a certain way. When you have that small group of people, it's not perceived as beneficial to empower people to perceive nuance in language or to develop knowledge in language that would allow them to think with different perspectives. So in this particular case, the concept that we're going to be developing here is the idea of functional literacy. So literacy is our ability to read and write. So that is kind of the first stage that we would have when we talk about language development. Now, the more you learn words, the more you learn vocabulary, and you understand the relationship between words, what's the difference between one thing and the other. And I had one student, I'll never forget the student, and I'm at this point, it's been so many years that I forgot his name. But he would come to the end of the class, would come every day, and he would just bring me 3 words and tell me to explain the difference between them. And they were, in some context, synonyms. And I would have to stop, and I was just like, oh, what is the difference? Because what is the connotation behind it? So when you start analyzing that, building your vocabulary and understanding the relationship between words and why someone will use a certain combination of words in order to make you react a certain way. So all of that is basically the idea of that we have a functional literacy. You can look at language and you can analyze the rhetoric. You can analyze what is being said and why it is being said in a certain way. So our power with language, and this is what I mean with language being a weapon, is that what we see in many countries nowadays is that it's those systemic problems in the educational system of those countries, and the fact that even though people might be literate, meaning that they know how to write and they know how to read, they are not equipped with the tools to look at language and think about this as being used intentionally, and that I have the power to learn how to use it intentionally as well. It doesn't mean that you learn language in a way that you are going to manipulate people, but you acquire more control of the language that you use and also how you react to language that is used towards you. It helps build emotional intelligence. It helps building more control of how we speak. And what I see nowadays is that the language that requires people to get your attention in social media, the language that requires someone to pledge loyalty to an institution or a group, requires them to close themselves to all of the other possibilities of language, because allowing yourselves to build new ones is seen as a threat to the existence of these same institutions, which I don't believe to be true. I think it's absolutely possible for us to come to a point that we're seeing each other as adversaries in different opinions that we might have, but not to think that the fact that these opinions exist, that is going to be a threat to my existence. The influence of these old age institutions and how they promote this level of communication, how sometimes even media companies use this in a way that is very irresponsible, is it's something that for me as an educator, it's very hard to see, because as I was growing up and I was lucky to have my education, in particular my history education, and allow me to see language in a different way. I have a very complex relationship with language, that language was used to kind of mine self-esteem. Language was used to make me afraid. And all of that triggered a lot of reactions. So my language journey is not only about learning how to use grammar or how to build vocabulary, but it's how language development actually opens doors and windows for the development of humanity as a whole. But at this stage, what I see in countries, in different countries with large populations, is that not only the educational system is failing, but the perception of the importance of an education is also failing. You can see that there are teachers leaving schools because the pushback on what allow children to say or not say, based on the building of new vocabulary, learning new words, and what is the difference between them. That's something that it causes so much fear, so much tension, that teachers feel they cannot teach anymore. And the rhetoric that comes against this is very hostile. It's not something that this is a different view, let's talk. It is, this is a different view, I hate you, you should not exist. And that gets to the point where you cannot help but see history repeating itself over and over again because of a tool that was created by humans, in that the techniques of how to use it, and it's not, for me, it's not a big deal to teach people how to use language functionally, how functional literacy works, and how you can develop media literacy as well. I actually recommend you watch the Crash Course on the Crash Course channel on YouTube. They have a fantastic course on media literacy and developing these skills. Like, I don't think that someone would be able to be a good communicator if they don't know how to use their language functionally. So, and this is something that it's not restricted to just your second language. So that's why for myself, the business that I have created, the school that I have created, I don't necessarily want you to think that you're coming into my online courses or my classes thinking, I'm just going to learn English as a second language like any English course. That's not what the purpose of my methodology is. The purpose of my methodology is to help you understand language as a tool, as something that is going to, I talk about development of emotional intelligence on the course English in Action. So it's not just what language would be as a second language, but how to start the development of the functional use of language, to develop functional literacy. And I find that, or maybe just because I've been watching the news over the 2 days, and, and I just felt I want to talk about it. It just feels that there are so many so many different populations that are kind of stuck in a loop of the idea that bringing education is harmful, making people understand functional literacy, media literacy are things that are going to, remove the cover over the eyes, kind of the Matrix Neo type of situation. But the what is difficult for the position of someone who would like to be an educator nowadays is that society has been feeding so much out of the things that can be so harmful that it at times it can feel very hopeless. But also as an educator, I think that there is a responsibility to build hope, to build awareness, to help people understand how language use builds our reality. It builds our ideas of each other. It builds how we choose to build society. And when it comes to, the any type of social movement that people might refer to as a circus, there's always the people who believe that for some reason that the education is something that is outdated, that they look down on the idea of developing critical thinking skills. And there's so many groups of small people, like small groups of people that have so much power, so much money, that it is very difficult not to see how rhetoric and how language is being used to make people choose easily. And also the systemic problems in education just come to put that even in escalate or make that problem even worse. The idea of the word of adversary and enemy, if I see someone as an enemy, the probability that I'm going to stop seeing that human being as a person is going to be so high. We're going to dehumanize each other. Your life does not matter as much as mine do because your existence is a threat. And you could just, at someone who's almost polarizing a point that is a 50-50, that can only be the influence of language being used by both sides in a way that is inflammatory rhetoric that's being used every time that we speak. And that for me is something that when I would like to teach language, when I would like to help people use language, that's what I mean about using language intentionally, right? This is what I mean is about understanding the difference between the words and being open to those explanations and what it really means when I stop seeing someone as an enemy and I see someone as an adversary. So then, and this is just one example, right? This is just one key example that I'm putting out here. But the fact is that that's how we have also found that is the only way that we can attract people's attention to, you know? We do it every time. I did it purposely on my thumbnail today. So it's so important for us to invest in the idea of understand more about media literacy, understand more about functional literacy, to understand that we can say the same thing using different words. And these different words are going to provoke different reactions on us. And these reactions are going to make us act as well. So, understanding how to receive this information, to decode it in a way that you give yourself control, that empowers you as a person, is really what I believe in an educator. That is the role of an educator. And I really want to thank my history teachers and point out how much pushback there was. One of the stories that I remember, it was my elementary school teacher, and she, she was kind of giving us the information and asking us to repeat. She was an educator. She had her methodology, but it got to the point that students feared her. And there was such a movement that you knew from the students started saying, hey, we're all going to complain about this teacher. And we're going to tell our parents to come here on Teacher's Day, and we are going to, be against her. And I would never forget walking past the room and seeing that teacher just like back on her desk, and there's just this circle of parents in front of her and telling her to stop picking on the students. And in retrospect, there was no such a thing. And that's kind of the same pattern that I have with most of my history teachers into that. And that for me just represents how the pushback of some values into education was happening when I was young, and I saw it. And as I continued developing what I understood as my notion of historical facts and all of that, what started to happen is I started to see some of the past with different eyes, and I cannot stress how much regret there is for how the treatment of the teacher happened at that time, and how much gratitude I have for what was taught at that time. That is it, and how the process of education, of actually learning to use new words to mention different things, it can open perspectives that sometimes are not going to necessarily feel good when you learn historical facts about something that could have impacted your existence. It's something that if you've never thought about that, if you open a little bit of your cognitive power to analyze that perspective, is something that will make you kind of go into conflict with some things that you thought about before. So we can see that a lot. An example of that is really the reconciliation movement that happens in Canada, for instance. How looking at something, giving new meaning and describing with words that accurately represent what happened can be something that can be painful for our society, and something that some people would like to avoid. And all of that is about language, right? And so sometimes when students ask me about vocabulary, I need to know more words. I usually think about the relationship of the levels of complexity that we have. That if I want to talk about something and I want to be very simplistic about it, I have this word at this level. If I want to be a little bit more complex, because that's going to add nuance, be more specific to what I'm talking about, I'm going to use that word. And when we start to see words as kind of this network of meanings and what we're trying to express and represent, that brings empowerment in how we use our language. That really makes us, it will change how we think, but it has the potential to make people come together instead of just fostering polarization, as we see every day. And that was not really what I had. That is a topic that I had for today for the podcast. I had a list of topics from before. I thought about this yesterday, worked on the ideas, and then just made it a little bit more urgent, just because it's how I feel about this topic right now. And this is our, our second episode of the podcast. I gave some recommendations. So the first recommendation that we have here is for you to watch a movie. The name of the movie is Wag the Dog. I'm gonna try to put the poster while I'm putting things, cutting this audio that I probably messed up. So watch the movie Wag the Dog. It really helps the idea and the understanding of how intentions and different reasons make us choose language and make us choose how we communicate. It's brought really much from a perspective, a political perspective, very kind of North American focus, but I think it just perfectly captures this process. And the one kind of also another book that I highly recommend to help us guide our communication process as well is The Four Agreements. I'm also going to try to put some of the link for that on the comments. And yeah, so read books, check new perspectives. Don't ever underestimate the power of education and opening yourself to seeing nuance, to investigating biases, to try to build a new perspective, and not to see someone who has different views from you as someone that you can dehumanize, as someone that you can reduce. That is going to bring the one thing that humanity knows historically, which is savagery. And it would be very nice as a millennial human being to see that the hopes that I was built with marketing and all around me, that they could be right, that people could people could work together, have different ideas. There's so much at stake, and I'm not going to comment on any specific fact because the objective of this podcast is really to reinforce the importance of functional literacy, which is a part of education that has been decreasing in many countries for many years. And as an educator and as someone who would like to just spread the message, that's what I wanted to talk about today. So we are going to continue. So this podcast happens every month. I'll be coming back with some of the other videos. There's just a lot going on now at the end of the year, but I do have some time for that. Don't forget that we have the Thinking in English bundle that is basically you can type the code SN50 and you have 50% discount on 4 courses. So you have access to all of the 4 courses and you have access to it for a 50% discount. And I'm going to put all the information on the description. What do you think, everybody? Have you ever considered the idea of functional literacy? That reading and writing is not the only thing that we need to develop, and that our idea and concept of how many words we know and vocabulary is very tightly connected with our ability to see nuance and analyze and develop our critical thinking. And that is something that I think a lot of people may be afraid of sometimes. Like when I talk to people and say, hey, let's talk politics, and it's just like, no, I don't know anything about politics, I don't want to talk about politics, because there's just a way that we stop ourselves from taking a look at these differences, see nuance, and find ways for us to collaborate instead of just building animosity towards each other. Because as a communicator, that's what I wish to everyone. So I hope you enjoyed the podcast today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.